So armed with our knowledge of arrays and conditionals, we will be able to build out this application now. So we'll be able to take an array of questions from this trivia API, bring them into our application, display them one at a time, and check which answer the user picks and mark it correct or incorrect. So before we actually do any of that coding, though, it is really useful to have a roadmap for our application, a roadmap for the logic in the form of a flowchart. So I highly encourage you to do this anytime you're working on your own project. I'm going to flip over to a whiteboard and let's go through it. So at the very top here, our application starts or it loads. And then the first thing we need to do is grab the first trivia item. So grab first trivia item from our array. And then we need to display that to the page and wait for the user to pick an answer. So we will display the trivia and wait for answer. And we've basically done this part already. We had a trivia item in a variable and we displayed it to the page. We didn't actually listen for an answer just yet. So once we listen for an answer, we need to check whether it was correct or incorrect. So if it was correct, we will do one thing. And if it was incorrect, we will do another thing. Anytime you see a branch like this, that's a hint that you're going to need a conditional. So this is the correct branch. This is the incorrect branch. So if they got the answer correct, we need to update the score and also change our trivia item to be highlighted in green. So update score, change answer to green. And this is to give the user feedback that yes, you got it right. If they got it incorrect, we don't need to touch the score, but we should still change their answer to red. So regardless of whether they got it correct or incorrect, we need to do the same thing next, which is check whether we have a trivia item left in our array. So look for next item in array. So say we're going to have 3 items in our array. The first time through, we will have a next trivia item. The next time through, we'll have another trivia item. And then the next time through, we have to end the game. So at some point, we're going to run out of items that are in our array. So we're going to have another branch in logic here, where if we have nothing left, no item left, this is game over. But if we do have an item left, then zoom out so that we can do this. If we have an item left, we come back up here. And this is the kind of loop structure of our application where we're going to keep running through this logic until we run out of trivia questions. So with that in mind, let's flip back to the code and start building out this logic. A couple of setup things. I am going to comment out our array demo code so that there's no longer a prompt popping up when I refresh this page. And then I also want to go to the trivia API and pull down a set of questions. So in this case, I'm going to pull down film questions that are easy, and I want multiple choice. And then I would hit generate API URL and get this URL that I can open up. And this will give me a set of 10 trivia items. So this is actually an array right here. So I could go ahead and copy this create a new file here called trivia items.js. Say trivia items are equal to this array. And one quick note here is that I have a Chrome extension installed called Json Formatter. So what you'll see if you don't have that installed is something that looks like this, where there's no white space. It's not easy to look at the object structure that we've got going on here. So you have two options if you're trying to pull something from this API. You can install the Json Formatter Chrome extension and load your page again, and you will end up with nicely formatted code that you can sort of expand and you can fold and unfold to be able to explore it. You can also just Google search for a Json Formatter, and then you could take this ugly code from here, copy it, paste it in, and you will have formatted code that you can download or copy and paste. So I recommend having the formatter installed, but either way, you will end up with some array that looks like this inside of your code. So you want to make sure that you check this structure as you're pasting it in, that there's an opening bracket, and that each item inside of your array is an object that has the category, type, difficulty, question, etc., followed by a comma, followed by another object, all the way down to the bottom, where we end our array with the closing bracket. So I'm gonna use code folding to fold my array here so that you can just focus on the general structure. So we saw that you can import JavaScript files. You can also export things from JavaScript files. So each file, when it's a module, is completely separate. So you declare a variable in trivia items. We can't use it in index.js. It doesn't exist. But if in this file we go ahead and say export default trivia items, whatever we're exporting here, we can now import over an index.js. So if I do import trivia items from trivia items.js, and I print this out in the console and check my browser, we can now see that there's an array of 10 items being printed out. I'll have a link to more information about the import-export structure in JavaScript. Basically, this is called a default export, which allows you to take something from your file and export it. And then on the import side, the structure looks like this, where we can actually call this whatever we want. Instead of trivia items, we could have called this all trivia items, and this would still work the same. So getting cracking here, I want to define a couple of functions that we're going to fill in. So there are a couple of things that we know for sure we're going to need to do, and we're going to need to do multiple times. So for instance, we know we're going to have to display a trivia item to the page. So I'm going to create a function for that. We're also going to need to clear the trivia items from the page. So anytime we go to display a new question, we have to remove the old one. We are going to need to update the score. And we're also going to need to update the question number. So if I flip back here, the question number is up here, so we're definitely going to want to make sure that we replace this with the current question number that we're on. And we're also going to create a function here for onAnswerClick. So this will be the function that we use to run and check the answer whenever any of these buttons is clicked. So I'm going to comment out the code that we had before. We're going to come back and reuse some of these pieces, but let's just fill out some of the easy things, like updating the score. To update the score, we need to get access to this element, which we gave an ID when we were writing the HTML, and then just change this to be whatever our score variable in our code is. So let's create a score variable. I'm going to set it equal to 0 to start the score at 0. And then our update score function, we will pass in a new score to it. We will set our score equal to whatever that new score is. And then we need to update the DOM. So update the element that's on the page here. In order to do that, we actually have to pull out that element from the page. So if we go back here, we have an ID on our score element. So all I need to do is create a variable here for score element and use query selector to pull out score. And then inside of this function, I can say the score element, the text inside of that score element is equal to whatever we want. So in this case, it is just a matter of passing in our score. So let's test this out. Update score to 10, and I'm saving it and checking it out. We can see 10. Let's bring these side by side. Update score to 20, and we can run it multiple times, and the last one will be the one that gets updated and we see it on the page. So whatever we pass in here is ending up as this new score variable or parameter inside of this function and being used to change our score variable here and also the element on our page. And I've put this into a function because we're going to have to update our score multiple times. So anytime we're going to have code that needs to run multiple times, rather than copy and paste this logic multiple times throughout our index.js, it makes sense to put it into a reusable block of code into a function. Okay, so let's now work on updating the question number. So inside of our code, we have this trivia items, which is an array of individual pieces of trivia, and we need to keep track of where we are in that array to know which element we're going to store. So we're going to have a trivia item index variable. So we'll start this off at 0, meaning that we are at location of index 0 in this array. And then when it comes time to display the next one, we will move that index up by 1 to be able to move to this question. So this will keep track of where we are in the array. And then update question number, what we need to do is anytime we have to update this, we will use that index to display where we are, and we will use the number of elements that are in our array here so that we can say that this is 1 of 10 or 1 of 5. So we're going to have to do a similar thing. In index, we have a ID here of question number. So over in index.js, we will grab question number element by using document.querySelector. And inside of this function, we can go ahead and set the text content, so the text of that element, to be a string. And we kind of want to be able to say like 1 of 10 or something like that. So the number that comes here would be our index. This is almost right, but remember that index starts counting at 0. So if we were to use the index directly, we would end up seeing, let me run this method so that, or this function so that we can see it. 0 of 10 print out for the first item and 1 of 10 for the second. So actually we want to say that we are at index plus 1. So when we have an index of 0, we're seeing 1. And then instead of hard coding 10 here, what we want to use is the number of elements inside of our array. And there is a length property of any array that allows you to get that number. So we should see 1 of 10 here. And if I go ahead and go to my trivia items, and if I just delete 2 of these and save it and run it, I should see 1 of 8. Delete another one. 1 of 7. So however many trivia items we put in here, this will update to be the right thing. Let me undo that, save this, 1 of 10. So let's get some trivia displaying to the page. So we'll work on this display trivia item function. So what I want to do here is pass in a variable. We'll call it the trivia item. And this will be one of our elements from our array. So it will have a category, a type, a question, a correct answer, incorrect answers that we'll be able to use and display on the page. And we have code that basically already does that down here. So we no longer need this. But this code we can bring into display trivia item. So this was the code that takes the template, clones it, looks for the element that we have on our page that has a class of trivia item question, fills in the HTML. This looks for all of our buttons and fills them in with the correct answer and incorrect answers. And then it puts it on the page, this new trivia item that we created, into our trivia container. So before we work on this method, this function here, we want to go ahead and uncomment out these. So we want to make sure that we are grabbing our trivia item template from our DOM from the elements on our page, and also grabbing the trivia container from the elements on the page, since we're using them inside of this function. Next, we can work on, instead of saying trivia data in these places, we actually want to use trivia item, since that's the parameter name here. And I'm actually going to show you a way to pull out information from an object. So this will be the way that we sort of already know how to do it. Question equals trivia item dot question. So here all we're doing is, maybe I'll copy and paste one of these over so we have it for reference. So this is the structure of the trivia item variable that we have going on here. So this is a parameter to this method, to this function, rather, and we are going to pull out the individual elements. So question, correct answer equals trivia item dot correct answer, and incorrect answers. And then when we set the inner HTML of our question element, we are going to use this variable. For that first button, we are going to use correct answer. And then we are going to use incorrect answer here, here, and here. So we can test if this is working by coming down here, displaying trivia item. And what we're going to pass in here is our array, and we are going to use this index. So for now, I'm just going to pass in 0 so that this is a little easier to read. So this should print the first thing. What was the breed of dog? Blah, blah, blah. We got our 4 answers. If I try putting in index 3 or the 4th question, who wrote and directed Platoon? Let's try the last element in our array, the 9th element, Austin Powers. So we've got this reusable method here, this reusable function here that we can use multiple times throughout our application to display a trivia item to the page. So let's start setting this up. We are, instead of passing a hard-coded number in here, we are going to pass our trivia item index. And we're going to use this variable to control which item is loaded on the page. Let's also make sure that we have update question number here, so that however many elements are in an array gets displayed here, so that we can see that it's 1 of 10 since we have 10 questions in there. Let's go back to our display trivia items and make a couple of changes here. So one, I forgot to even show you this. What I wanted to show you was that when you have an object and you want to pull out multiple properties from that object, you can do what is called object destructuring. So I can type in question, comma, correct answer, comma, incorrect answers. and do all of this code in a single line. So this is creating a variable called question, correct answer, incorrect answers, and it is setting them equal to the values from our object with those property names. So this is a one-liner to do the same thing we were doing there. The other thing that I want to fix about this is that right now our correct answer is always the first button, which isn't a great user interface. Someone will figure that out and be able to get a perfect score. So what we want to do is actually shuffle these answers and display them. So I'm going to give you some code here that is a little bit more advanced, but not crazy, for shuffling an array. So you can either copy this code down by pausing the video, or I'll make sure that I also have it in Canvas. This is a common implementation of shuffling an array called the Fisher-Yates algorithm. Basically what this does is make a copy of whatever array you pass it in, starts at the back of the array, and goes through a process of swapping elements randomly in the array, and then it returns the final shuffled array. But basically what we're doing here is, again, we're using this export syntax. So we have a shuffle file that exports this shuffle function, which should take an array and give us back a randomized version of that array. So what we can do in index is create a variable here called all answers, and create a new array that has our correct answer plus the incorrect answers all in one array. And this syntax would be maybe the long way that we could do it, where we're saying, okay, the first thing in here is the correct, and then we're going to put the 1, 2, and 3 elements from our incorrect answers. Another way to express this is using the spread syntax, which for arrays means that it will take whatever this array is and essentially give us the syntax that we had a second ago, where it's putting each individual element from that array in here. So this line is giving us an array with 4 things in it, the correct answer plus the 3 incorrect answers. So I can shuffle this. So shuffled answers equals import shuffle from our shuffle file, shuffle.js, run shuffle on all those answers, and let's see what we've got here. So I'm going to print out all answers, and I'm also going to print out shuffled answers. Whoops. And let's flip back here and take a look at the console. So the first array we have has 4 things. So Labrador, Golden Retriever, Dalmatian. And the second one has those things, but shuffled. So if I refresh the page, we should likely see this second array changing every time I refresh it. So now what we want to do is take these shuffled things and put them into button 1, 2, 3, and 4. So what I'm going to do here is get rid of this code. We'll comment this out. Remember that button elements is essentially an array, so we can loop over it, or we can use our for each to loop over it. So button elements for each button and index. This function will now run once for each button that is on the page, and we will also have access to the index. So for instance, if I do button.inner HTML equals index and look at our page, 0, 1, 2, 3. So we are running that function on each one of these and injecting the index, but that's not what we want to do. What we want to do is instead use our shuffled answers here and use our index. And this works because we have 4 elements in our shuffled answers, and we have 4 elements in our button elements. So this button elements array. So this works out that when we grab the index of our button elements, we can use it to just grab the corresponding shuffled answer. So we check this out. Every time we reload the page, we should have a new order for our answers. So I can get rid of this console log here. I can get rid of our comment. And what we also want to do when we loop over these buttons is wire them up so that onAnswerClick runs when those buttons are clicked. So we can use add event listener. So we can say button add event listener. And into here, we will say click. When any of these is clicked, then trigger the onAnswerClick function. And if we print something out here, like console.log, clicked a button, and flip back, anytime we click on one of these, we are seeing that console log message pop up. So inside of onAnswerClick, anytime you have an event listener, like we have here, we actually get a parameter that is coming from the browser. And so we get a parameter called event. And if we print this out, .log event, we can see some of the properties that that event has. So if I click on this first one, we can see that this is a mouse event. We are being told where we clicked. So we're getting screen X, screen Y. We are getting a path of elements that was clicked through the DOM, getting to that button. We also have a property here called target, which tells us which element was just clicked. So we're going to be able to use that to read the contents of that button to say, okay, they clicked on golden retriever. Is that the correct answer for this question or not? So I'm going to use our array destructuring syntax again, or I'm sorry, our object destructuring syntax. Target equals event. And let's print out the target here, and let's also print out the target's inner HTML. So we just clicked on golden retriever, and we're also able to get that content of the button. Lab, we get that button, and we also get the content of that button. So to be able to tell if this was the correct answer, let's actually pull this out. Let's say this is the selected answer. We also need to have a variable here that stores the correct answer. So then it's a question of like, well, how do we get that? Where is that coming from? And so we have this array, trivia items, that we can access in here. And we have this variable, trivia item index, that tells us which element in the array are we at. So we can say trivia items, trivia item index, and that will give us, if we look back at our trivia items folder file, that will give us one of these objects. So then we can just reach in and grab the correct answer property to have the corresponding answer for whatever question we are currently displaying. So correct underscore answer. And I'll get rid of this. We can now use an if statement, a conditional, to be able to say, is the selected answer equal to the correct answer? If so, let's go ahead and update our score to be score plus 1. If it's not, let's just print out something like wrong answer to the console. So you can see that my score is going up every time I click on the right answer, and then when I click on the wrong answer, it's telling me that I got the wrong answer. And this code that we've written should work regardless of where we are in our array. So if I come back here and I changed which trivia item we're on to be the 5th item, what was the title of the first Bond movie? Wrong, wrong, correct, wrong. So I think the next thing we want to do is actually change the element, the class on the element that we clicked on, to either show that it's correct or incorrect. And remember that when we wrote our CSS, we, in triviaitem.css, had these classes here for correct and incorrect that we are able to apply to a button to change the background color. So I'm going to copy this. So if we got the correct answer, that button, so target, we want to change the class that it has. We want to add a class to it. And so there is a property called class list on HTML elements that allows us to add or to remove or to check whether there's a class on this element. So we just want to add trivia item correct. And when we got it wrong, we want to add incorrect. So let's see if this works now. Incorrect. Let's refresh it. Try the correct answer. Correct. Let's also make sure that we can't check multiple answers after we have selected our first. So if we come back to our code, we want to do two things. Remember in our CSS, we created this styling for disabled buttons, which makes them look grayed out. And then there is also a disabled attribute that we can add to a button that prevents it from being interacted with. So if you have a click listener and you set the button to disabled, then the click listener will no longer run. Your mouse events will no longer trigger. So what we want to do here is get access to all of our buttons, apply disabled to all of them. So we'll disable them all here. And then we're selectively applying correct or incorrect down here. So to disable all of the buttons, we need to get access to them again. So what we can do is a similar thing to what we did up here, where we query selector all for trivia item underscore underscore button. But what we want to do is talk to the trivia container. So the element that's on the page that has the current trivia added to it, that's what we want to talk to get the buttons that are on the page. So trivia item, trivia container dot query selector all, and we want trivia item button. Store that all, or let's call this button elements. Then we can loop over all of those buttons. So button elements dot for each button index, and actually we don't even need the index for the loop that we're writing here, so we can just get rid of that and just get button. We can say button dot disabled equals true to disable the button, and then also apply our class. So class list dot add, and we're gonna do our disabled version. So I'm just gonna copy the CSS here, trivia item button disabled. And if I flip back, we should be able to pick one. All of them go disabled, and I can no longer click them anymore. So our click event listeners are prevented from running. And if I check out one of these buttons, we can see it has this disabled attribute set on it. In addition to, it has our trivia disabled and our trivia incorrect. Let's flip back to our code here. We can say that this is check the answer and mark it correct or incorrect. And then what we need to do is go to the next question. So we want to display a new trivia item in addition to clearing the previous trivia item, and we also need to move our trivia item index up by 1. So I'm going to make this 0. We want to do trivia item index plus equals 1 so that we're moving to the next one. And then we want to run this line of code again, where we display the element that's in our array that corresponds to that index. We also want to update our question number here. For this, let's say, I'm going to put a comment in here to say to do clear the previous trivia. And let's check out what happens. So I click on one of these, our next trivia item appears below it. I click on one of these, the next one appears below it, and so on till we run out of questions. So we need to do this clearing, and we created a function here called clear trivia. So I'm going to just set it up so that that function runs. Right now it doesn't do anything. So we'll scroll up here and we'll fill it out. So clearing the trivia is a matter of going into our DOM, so going into where our trivia container is and making sure that it's empty, removing any elements that are inside of this. So if we go back here, we have our trivia container pulled out. So inside of here, trivia item, trivia container has a property called children. Let's print this out. So if I run it, click on something, we're getting a HTML collection of all of the elements that are inside of that trivia container. So what we want to do is loop over all of the children that are in that container. So I'm going to use a for loop here for child of trivia item trivia container.children. Trivia container dot remove child. So what we're saying here is take this thing that's like an array. It's slightly different than an array, but it acts like an array. So it's a collection. It's an iterable. So we can write this loop like we've done for looping over arrays to pull out each element that is a child inside of this HTML collection of children. And then what we can say is trivia container, go ahead and remove this particular child. So if we save this, flip back, run it, we can see now there's only one trivia item on the page at a time. But this isn't a great user interface because we have no chance to see whether we got it correct or incorrect. So let's flip back and come back down here. So this going to the next question, all of this logic, we kind of want to pause for a second to let the player see whether they got it right or wrong, take that in before we go to the next one. So I'm going to show you a really simple way that we can add a delay here, and then if we have time, or maybe I'll include it as a bonus video, how we can animate the elements off the screen. So the easy way is that there is a method called setTimeout, a function in the JavaScript API called setTimeout, which you can pass a function in here. I'm going to use an arrow function, and then you pass as a second parameter how long to wait. So this is in milliseconds. So 1,000 milliseconds would be wait 1 second and then run whatever is inside of this function. So if I just grab these and put them inside of this function, when we go to the next question, this won't trigger until 1 second has passed. So if I run it, click on one, wrong answer, we get a second to look at it, and then we can try again for the next one. I'm not actually reading these questions carefully, so I'm doing horrible here. Okay, let's get one of these right. So this was Dr. No, so we can see our score going up. And I'm going to click through these really quickly to get to the last one. So here we're on the last question, and then we get an error because what happened? Well, we tried to, let me unpause the debugger here, tried to destructure the property question of trivia item, but it's undefined, which means that we got here, we tried to display a trivia item, but our index was higher than the number of elements that we had in the array. So we tried to access something that wasn't there. So this function, which we were expecting an object to be passed into, just got undefined because we had stepped one too many in our array. So what we need to do down here to sort of finish this off is check, is this index exceeding the number of elements that we have? So if trivia item index is equal to trivia item items dot length, this means we've exceeded the number of items. We've gone one past in terms of indices. So we can have an else clause here that goes ahead and displays the next question. And inside of here, we need to kind of have some sort of end screen. And I think because this video is going a little long, let's just display an alert that says game over. Oh, or we can say game over, final score, and we can pass in the score here. So I'm going to temporarily come into this file, and I am going to make sure that there are only 3 questions in here so that I can click through them really quickly. I'm just selecting all of those lines, hitting Control / to comment them out. I can flip back here. So now we see we have got 3 questions. Click through. We reach our end. It says game over, and it tells us our final score. So let me uncomment those. And let's do a quick overview of what we wrote before we wrap this up and move on to the next thing. So we did a lot here. We saw how to use the import syntax in conjunction with the export default syntax to separate out our code. So here we put all of the data of our application into a separate file so that we could import it on demand when we need it. And we put a shuffle function in a separate file so that we could import it when we need it. This will really help us as we move into React to separate out our logic into separate files. We also made heavy use of functions in this project. So we thought about the core logic as we were doing our whiteboarding. And we separated out the pieces of core logic into functions. So for instance, we know that we're going to have 10 trivia items and we're going to have to display each of those. So instead of writing that code 10 times, we turn that into one reusable block of code. So it takes as a parameter, as an input, a trivia item and is able to put that on the page. And so then we can just reuse this chunk of code anytime we need to put a trivia item on the page. So functions are going to be a really important concept for us going forward. So if you're feeling a little uncomfortable with this, spend some time reading this deeply. And if you're still feeling uncomfortable, check out some tutorials on functions in JavaScript to help fill in some of the background. So we broke code down into reusable chunks and made those functions. And we also, at the bottom here, have our state of our application as global variables in this file. So we have the score and the trivia item index. And the score is what we're keeping track of for the player's score, and the trivia item index is where are we in this trivia items array currently. So we start at 0, meaning we're displaying this one, and then we're able to increase that index to move to the next question in our trivia item array. So one general tip as you're reviewing this and thinking about the code that we wrote is that some of the code we've written previously, like if we look in our arrays demo, runs from top to bottom. It's pretty easy to trace the code. You start at line 1, that's what gets executed in the browser, then it keeps going to line 2, then 3, then 4, then 5. And when we're writing our code for more complex applications like we did here, it still executes from top to bottom, but all of these function calls are adding a level of indirection here. So as soon as the browser gets down to line 83 and it sees an invocation of the update question number function, it hops up here to line 38 and runs, and then hops back down here to line 84 to run display trivia item, which then hops back up here to line 8 and keeps running through. So as you're reading your code, it's going to involve a little bit more on your part to track what's happening. And one way that you can track some of this as you are learning JavaScript is to throw a bunch of console logging along the way. So if you're curious, what does trivia item look like at this point, you can print out trivia item. And if you're curious what shuffled answers looks like, print out shuffled answers. And so as you're running your code and you look at your browser output, you can see all of that, and that will help you trace what's happening. So you'll see the sequence of things showing up in the console, which will tell you which code executed at what time, and you'll also be able to peek into the different variables to see what they look like at any moment in time. So we built the sort of core of a trivia application here. We will keep building on it as we move into React. I think the next video will be a short bonus video that'll be how do we add some animation to this to improve the user interface a little bit. But then we're gonna hop into the React world. We're gonna leave the raw HTML, CSS, JavaScript behind a little bit and start translating this application into React so that we can build it out in a more maintainable way.